The morning my stepfather walked into my office at First National Bank, I almost didn't recognize him. The decade since I'd last seen him hadn't been kind. His once dark hair was now steel gray, his confident stride replaced by an anxious shuffle. "I need to speak with the loan officer," he told my secretary, not even glancing at me behind my desk. "It's about the Harrison manufacturing application." "You're speaking to her," I said, watching him freeze at the sound of my voice. "Hello, Robert." He turned slowly, his face draining of color as recognition hit. "Alexandra, please sit down." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, enjoying how his hands shook as he lowered himself into it. "I understand you're here about a loan." My name is Alexandra Chen, and 10 years ago, Robert Harrison had stolen everything from me. My mother's death had been sudden, a car accident that left me orphaned at 18. The inheritance she'd set aside for me, meant to pay for college and give me a start in life, had mysteriously disappeared in the weeks following her funeral. "There must be some mistake," Robert sputtered, clutching his briefcase like a shield. "I need to speak with someone in authority." I smiled, smooth as silk. "As Chief Lending Officer, I assure you, I am the authority on this matter." I pulled out his loan application, noting how his eyes widened at the sight of his company's desperate financial statements. Now about Harrison Manufacturing's situation. What Robert didn't know, what none of my colleagues knew, was that I hadn't just survived his theft, I thrived. The night he kicked me out, claiming my mother's will left everything to him, I'd taken one thing, her old leather notebook, filled with business contacts and financial records. Those contacts had helped me piece together what really happened to my inheritance. More importantly, they'd given me my start in the banking world, where I'd spent the last decade building connections and influence. "The company needs this loan," Robert said, his voice rough. "Without it, you'll lose everything." I finished for him. "How interesting. Tell me, does that feeling remind you of anything? Perhaps a certain conversation we had 10 years ago." He shifted uncomfortably. "Alexandra, whatever grievances you think you have about the past." "Think I have?" I cut him off, pulling out another folder. "You mean like these bank records showing how you transferred my inheritance into offshore accounts? Or perhaps these documents proving the will you presented was forged?" His face went from pale to ashen. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say Mom taught me well. She always kept receipts." I tapped her notebook, which sat prominently on my desk. "She also taught me to play the long game." And what a game it had been. After Robert had thrown me out, I'd spent months living with my best friend Julie, working 2 jobs while piecing together evidence of his fraud. But instead of confronting him then, I'd waited, watching as he grew complacent in his stolen wealth. I'd worked my way through college on scholarships and loans, then climbed the banking ladder with single-minded determination. Each promotion brought me closer to this moment, when Robert would walk into my office, desperate for help, not knowing I held his fate in my hands. "Your company needs $50 million to avoid bankruptcy," I said, reviewing his application. "That's quite a sum. Tell me, how did Harrison Manufacturing end up in such dire straits?" He swallowed hard. "Market changes, unexpected setbacks. Poor management," I added, flipping through more pages. "Risky investments, failed expansions. It seems the same reckless behavior that led you to steal from an 18-year-old girl has finally caught up with you." "I did what I had to do," he snapped, a flash of his old arrogance showing through. "You were just a child. You would have wasted that money on frivolous." "On college," I interrupted. "On building a future, instead of what you did, gambling it away on failed business ventures." I pulled out more documents. "Did you think I wouldn't find out how you lost most of it within 2 years?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside my office, I could hear the usual bustle of bank business continuing, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind my closed door. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Want? I'm just doing my job, Robert. Evaluating loan applications, assessing risk." I paused, letting the moment stretch. "Making decisions that affect people's lives." The next morning, I sat in the executive boardroom, Robert's loan application spread out before me. The other committee members filed in, taking their usual seats around the mahogany table. "The Harrison Manufacturing proposal," I began, "requires special consideration." What none of them knew was that I'd spent the night reviewing not just the loan application, but a decade of Robert's business decisions. Each failed venture, each desperate attempt to recoup his losses, it painted a picture of a man who'd never learned from his mistakes. The numbers are concerning, Janet, our risk analyst, pointed out. Their debt-to-equity ratio is problematic, I finished, but there's more. I started distributing folders I'd prepared. I've uncovered some interesting patterns in their financial history. The folders contained carefully selected information, enough to show Robert's mismanagement without revealing my personal connection. I'd spent years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence while staying in the shadows. My phone buzzed. A text from Julie. He's in the lobby again. Looks desperate. Of course he was. After yesterday's meeting, Robert had probably spent a sleepless night realizing exactly who held his fate in their hands. The man who once told me I'd never amount to anything was now pacing our bank's lobby, waiting for my decision. There's also the matter of their collateral, I continued, turning to page 3. The factory properties they're offering as security. They're not exactly what they seem. The committee leaned forward as I revealed what my investigation had uncovered. The properties Robert was offering as collateral were heavily leveraged, their value inflated through creative accounting, the same kind of manipulation he used to hide my inheritance. Ms. Chen, our chairman spoke up, your thoroughness is impressive. But I'm curious, why such detailed investigation into this particular application? I kept my expression neutral. Let's just say I have a special interest in ensuring we make the right decision here. During the lunch break, I found Robert still waiting in the lobby, looking like he aged another decade overnight. Any news? He asked, jumping up as I passed. The committee is still deliberating, I replied coolly. Though I must say, those property valuations you provided, quite creative. His face fell. Alexandra, please. The company employs hundreds of people. Their livelihoods matter to you now? I cut him off. Where was this concern for others when you left me penniless? I made mistakes, he admitted, running a hand through his gray hair. Terrible mistakes, but this isn't about me anymore. Those families. Don't, I held up my hand. Don't try to manipulate me with guilt. You lost that right a long time ago. Back in the boardroom, the committee's discussion continued. They were leaning toward rejection. The numbers simply didn't justify the risk. But I had one more card to play. I have a proposal, I said, pulling out a final document. A way to potentially save the company while protecting our interests. The terms I drafted were exacting. Majority control would shift to a board of our choosing. Robert would step down as CEO, and a significant portion of the company's assets would be placed in trust for the employees. It's unusual, the chairman mused, reviewing the terms. But given the circumstances, by late afternoon the decision was made. I had Robert shown into my office one last time, the final papers laid out on my desk. The committee has reached a decision, I told him, watching his face carefully. We're prepared to offer funding, but with conditions. As I outlined the terms, I saw the reality of his situation sink in. He would lose control of his company, but the employees would be protected. It was more mercy than he'd shown me, but this wasn't about revenge anymore. Why? He asked finally, staring at the papers. Why not just destroy me completely? I thought about the 18-year-old girl I'd been, scared and alone, and the woman I'd become despite his actions. Because I said quietly, someone needs to break this cycle of destruction. 2 months after the loan agreement was signed, I stood in Harrison Manufacturing's main factory, watching the morning shift change. Workers streamed in, their jobs secured now under the new management structure. Robert's office, once decorated with expensive artwork and pretentious awards, had been converted into a training center for employee development. Ms. Chen, Sarah, the new HR director we'd appointed, approached with a stack of files. The employee trust documents are ready for your review. I nodded, taking the papers. The trust would ensure that 30% of the company's profits went directly to employee benefits and profit sharing, something Robert had always dismissed as unnecessary expense. The irony wasn't lost on me that his greed had ultimately led to his workers gaining more than he'd ever given them. My phone buzzed. A text from Julie. Have you seen the news? I pulled up the local business journal's website. There it was, the story I'd been expecting. Robert Harrison, former CEO of Harrison Manufacturing, Files for personal bankruptcy. The article detailed how his personal assets, many purchased with my stolen inheritance, were being liquidated to pay his debts. The mansion he lived in, the cars, the vacation homes, all gone. He'd finally learned what it felt like to lose everything. But as I walked through the factory floor, watching people work with renewed energy and purpose, I realized something important. This wasn't just about revenge or justice anymore. It was about transformation. Alexandra. I turned to find Robert standing there, looking oddly small in his casual clothes. As part of the loan agreement, he'd been allowed to stay on as a technical consultant. His engineering knowledge was still valuable, even if his business judgment wasn't. The employee training program you implemented, he said awkwardly. It's working better than I expected. People tend to surprise you when you give them a chance, I replied. When you invest in them instead of just using them. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the factory floor. Your mother, she tried to tell me that years ago. About investing in people. He paused. She would be proud of what you've done here. Not just here, I said, handing him a newspaper. Look at page 6. He opened it to find an article about First National Bank's new scholarship program for disadvantaged youth, funded by the interest from his loan payments. His hands trembled slightly as he read. The money you stole from me, I said quietly. It was never just about the amount. It was about opportunity. Now it's finally being used the way Mom intended, to give opportunities to others. Later that day, as I prepared to leave the factory, I found an old photo tucked into my office door. Mom and me at my high school graduation, both of us smiling with hope for the future. Robert must have left it. On the back, he'd written, I'm sorry, I know it's not enough, but I'm finally learning what Alexandra Stevens taught us both, that true success isn't about what you take, but what you give back. 1 year later, Harrison Manufacturing had become a model of corporate responsibility. The employee trust was thriving, profits were up, and the training center had launched careers for dozens of local youth. Robert continued his technical consulting, humbled but gradually earning respect for his engineering expertise rather than his position. He never regained his wealth or status. But he found something he'd never had before, the genuine appreciation of people he'd helped rather than exploited. As for me, I kept my position at the bank, but my focus shifted. Instead of looking for opportunities for revenge, I started looking for chances to transform other struggling companies the same way we transformed Harrison Manufacturing. The leather notebook still sits on my desk, Mom's business contacts and notes now joined by my own. But these days, when I open it, I don't see just a record of past wrongs. I see a blueprint for making things right. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about building something better from the ruins of what they tried to take from you. And sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up teaching you the most important lessons, not through their success, but through their failures. The inheritance Robert stole was meant to give me a future. In the end, it did, just not in the way anyone expected. It taught me that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you build. And what we built from the ashes of his greed was worth far more than what he'd stolen.